Imagine waking up as a prince, only to discover you'll be publicly executed in just 3 years. No cheat system, no overpowered skills, just a death sentence that can't be escaped. But there's one thing that makes this prince different. The moment he touches a living creature, he can transform into it. A crow to spy on enemies, a squirrel to sneak through impossible places, even a horse to escape without anyone noticing. Unfortunately, the story had other plans. Earlier, this young man had been living a miserable life. He often cursed the so-called friend who had offered him an investment opportunity years ago. Although he had initially refused, his friend had persistently pressured him until he finally signed the papers. At the time, he failed to notice the mocking smile on his friend's face. Now, in the present, he was barely surviving. Burdened by debt, his life had become a complete wreck. The one thing that kept him going was his favorite novel, Dark Header. He had read it hundreds of times, yet it always carried a strange new charm, as though the story breathed differently with each reading. By now, he had practically memorized every detail written within its pages. Suddenly, he noticed something odd. Two feathers were drifting outside his window, glowing with a faint purple energy. Before he could make sense of what he was seeing, his nose began to bleed. A sharp, sudden pain split through his chest. He barely had time to process the situation before everything went dark. The next moment, he opened his eyes in a completely different place. At first, he thought it was a dream. However, the room he found himself in was far too luxurious to be his own. As he looked outside the window, he saw dozens of crows perched on a nearby tree. One of them began calling directly at him. Assuming it was still a dream, he tried to calm himself. Suddenly, the crow became strangely friendly, leaving him utterly confused. He then walked toward the window and froze. 3 suns hung high in the sky. Below them stretched a vast city that looked strangely familiar. When he finally caught sight of his reflection, the truth struck him like lightning. He had become the 7th prince of the Aberran Empire. Just then, a maid named Anna called for him from outside the room. Startled, he tried to stop her from entering, but he lost his balance and stumbled to the floor. Somehow, Anna seemed to understand what had happened and immediately said that she would return later. After hearing her voice and seeing his surroundings, he finally confirmed his suspicions. This world was the very setting of the novel Dark Header. However, there was one major problem. Of all the characters he could have become, he had possessed Ranaburan. Unlike the powerful princes who dominated the story, Ran was destined to die a miserable death early in the novel. While alone in his room, he cursed his terrible luck. Suddenly, someone called out to him from behind and introduced himself as Sin. The prince's expression went cold the moment he heard the name. He knew exactly who this man was and what he was truly after. Sin noted that the prince had skipped dinner, explained that the worry had driven him to come personally, and asked whether he was feeling better now. The boy, who was no longer himself, took a slow, steadying breath. He needed to be calm. He met Sane's gaze and told him that he was feeling much better now. Swayhan then requested that the table be prepared. Anna quickly obeyed and arranged the meal before the prince. Her hands trembled throughout the entire process. When Ranaburan looked at the dishes, he could hardly believe that such unappetizing food was being served to a member of the imperial family. He accidentally touched the hot teapot and immediately burned his hand. The reaction that followed completely caught him off guard. Anna's face instantly turned pale as though a catastrophe had occurred. She threw herself onto the floor and repeatedly begged for forgiveness despite having done nothing wrong. Watching the terrified maid, Ran finally remembered an important detail about the original owner of this body. The real Ran Aberran had a violent temper and frequently lashed out at servants whenever something displeased him. It was no wonder the slightest accident could send the palace staff into panic. Meanwhile, Sin expressed relief over seeing the prince in better condition. However, the secretary quickly revealed the true reason for his visit by unrolling several documents across the table. The moment Ran saw the papers, alarm bells immediately rang inside his head. Thanks to his knowledge of the novel, he already knew those documents were fraudulent and designed to siphon away the prince's wealth. The original Ran would have signed them without a second thought, making him an easy target for manipulation. Si Chan appeared amused by the hesitation and mocked the prince's inability to sign immediately. The ridicule stirred unpleasant memories from his previous life. Once again, he remembered the contract that had ruined everything and the blind trust he had placed in someone who never deserved it. The similarities between both situations were impossible to ignore. A new determination formed inside him. Rather than signing, he calmly pointed out irregularities in the figures and questioned the wasteful spending outlined in the documents. Shine looked genuinely surprised that the prince had noticed anything at all. Although the secretary attempted to redirect the conversation and pressure him into signing anyway, Ran had already made up his mind. mind. He refused to continue living as a puppet controlled by others. As the tension increased, Rand deliberately dropped a pocket watch onto the floor. The expensive item shattered into pieces upon impact, leaving fragments scattered across the carpet. He casually blamed the accident on a slip of the hand, though the act was entirely intentional. Knowing that Sin possessed far less influence than he pretended, Rand decided it was time to teach the arrogant secretary a lesson. The hatred visible on Sin's face only confirmed that the confrontation was working. Without giving the man any room to argue, Rand shifted the blame onto him and claimed the distraction had caused the accident. He then pointed toward the mess covering the floor and ordered Sin to clean everything personally. The command stunned the secretary. In the Empire, members of the imperial family stood above nearly everyone else and were treated with authority bordering on divinity. Even though Ran Aberon was considered the black sheep of the royal family, his status still far exceeded that of a mere secretary. Sin struggled to hide his resentment. Deep down, he despised the prince and often viewed him as a worthless embarrassment. The prince's black hair only reinforced those negative opinions. Even so, the authority of the imperial bloodline left him with little choice. Swallowing his pride, he knelt down and began cleaning the floor while suppressing his anger. Once the task was finished, Sin announced that the room had been cleaned. Before he could leave, however, Rand casually kicked a nearby cup and created another mess. The secretary stared at him in disbelief, while the prince coldly remarked that additional practice would improve his cleaning skills. The humiliation pushed Sin closer to his breaking point, yet he still lacked the power to openly resist. Unable to endure any more humiliation, Sin threatened to report everything to the Empress. Unfortunately for him, Rand already knew the threat was meaningless. The secretary possessed no direct line of communication with the imperial family and relied entirely on borrowed authority. He then turned toward Achan and ordered her to cover her ears. Fear immediately appeared in her eyes, and she obeyed without hesitation. Once he was certain she could hear nothing, Rand began revealing secrets that should have been impossible for him to know. He exposed the embezzlement, schemes, and hidden crimes that Satan had carefully concealed for years. With every accusation, the secretary's face grew paler until he resembled someone staring directly at death itself. Not long afterward, rumors began spreading among the servants. Anna and several maids quietly discussed the prince's unusual behavior and struggled to understand what had changed. In some ways, he seemed even more frightening than before. Yet, despite their fears, they also noticed that he rarely left the palace anymore, which provided a small sense of relief. Meanwhile, Rand spent much of his time inside the palace library. While gazing through the windows at the cloudy sky, he reflected on how successfully he had adapted to his role. The servants now avoided him whenever possible, and Sin had completely disappeared after their confrontation. Since the original story would not begin for another year, he felt little urgency and allowed himself to relax for the first time since arriving in this world. Memories of his previous life resurfaced. He remembered discovering Dark Header in a library and becoming completely captivated by its story. Now that he lived inside that very world, he intended to enjoy the calm period before the true protagonist appeared. While staring at the endless sky beyond the palace grounds, he found himself imagining how incredible it would be to soar above the landscape with wings of his own. He suddenly felt an intense pain erupt throughout his body. The cup in his hand slipped from his grasp and shattered against the floor as agony spread through every part of him. Unlike the pain that accompanied his death in his previous world, this sensation felt completely different. It was as if his entire body had been thrown into a furnace. Not long afterward, Achan arrived to perform her usual cleaning duties. Since the room appeared empty at first glance, she quietly considered herself fortunate that the troublesome prince was nowhere to be seen. Her attention soon shifted toward the shattered cup lying on the floor. Seeing such an expensive object destroyed saddened her, especially when she thought about how much that single cup could have helped her struggling family. Before she could dwell on it further, a strange sound emerged from behind a stack of books. A red-eyed crow suddenly flew out from the shadows, startling her. The bird circled around the room several times while Anna stared at it in confusion. Unable to understand how it had entered the palace library, she eventually managed to catch it. While holding the crow, she warned the creature that a frightening person lived in this room and that remaining there was dangerous. Hearing those words, Rand finally realized something shocking. He was no longer inside his human body. He had transformed into the very crow Anna was holding. Before he could process the situation, Anna carried him toward the window and tossed him outside without hesitation. Panic instantly overwhelmed him as the ground rushed closer and closer beneath him. As the wind roared past him, Rand desperately searched for a way to survive. Moments before impact, an instinctive thought surfaced inside his mind. He focused entirely on his wings and forced himself to move them. To his astonishment, his body responded. The frantic flapping gradually slowed his descent until he managed to stabilize himself in the air. Instead of plummeting toward death, he found himself soaring above the palace grounds. After spending some time experimenting, he eventually flew back to the palace and discovered that the transformation could indeed be reversed. Ran quickly learned that he could freely shift between both forms simply through conscious intent. Despite the usefulness of the ability, it also created a serious problem. Nothing resembling this power had ever existed in the original story, since the ability was absent from Dark Header, revealing it could drastically alter future events until he understood its origin. Secrecy seemed like the safest option. His thoughts were interrupted when Anna informed him that the monthly royal ritual was about to begin. The announcement immediately caught his attention. This event appeared ceremonial on the surface, but those familiar with the inner workings of the empire understood its true purpose. It served as a succession examination where members of the imperial family displayed their talents and power before the emperor. Having only read about the ritual in a novel, Rand felt curious about witnessing it firsthand. Soon afterward, he entered the grand hall and joined the rest of the imperial family. The contrast between himself and his relatives could not have been more obvious. His brothers possessed dazzling blonde hair and naturally commanding appearances, while his own black hair made him stand out like an unwelcome shadow among them. Before long, one particular prince directed a hostile glare toward him. The source of that hostility was Salos Aron, the 8th prince and one of Ron's half-bros. As always, Salos treated him with open contempt and launched into a series of insults. Instead of responding, Ron simply ignored him. The lack of reaction only irritated Sos further. Fortunately, the first princess arrived and immediately put an end to the disturbance, forcing the younger prince to remain silent. As everyone settled into their seats, Rand carefully observed the arrangement around the table. The positions reflected the hierarchy established by strength and influence. In this empire, power came from a force known as manis. Individuals born with brighter hair colors generally possessed greater amounts of this energy, granting them tremendous advantages. Since Rand lacked manis entirely and had black hair, he occupied the lowest position among the royal family. Despite his status as a prince, the atmosphere changed the moment the emperor entered the hall. Every royal immediately rose from their seats to welcome the ruler of the empire. The emperor calmly took his place and ordered the ritual to begin with, little interest visible on his face. In front of him rested an ancient artifact known as prasa, a relic left behind by the empire's founding ruler. The tablet possessed the ability to measure a person's manis and display their current strength. When the emperor placed his hand upon the artifact, a brilliant blue light erupted from its surface. The energy surged across the entire table and reached its very end, demonstrating power far beyond what anyone else present could hope to achieve. After displaying his strength, the emperor challenged any of his children to compare their abilities against his own. The invitation carried no arrogance because everyone already knew the outcome. As expected, the first prince accepted the challenge. Such displays had become routine because he enjoyed reminding everyone why he stood closest to the throne. In a society where manis represented authority itself, demonstrating superior power reinforced his position as the most likely successor. Confidently stepping forward, he activated his abilities and released a tremendous amount of energy. Then everything went wrong. A look of shock appeared on the first prince's face. Moments later, blood spilled from his mouth and stained the floor beneath him. Panic immediately erupted throughout the hall as nobles and servants rushed forward in confusion. The prince's brothers demanded answers while the ceremony descended into chaos. Only Ran understood the true significance of what had happened. According to the story, he remembered the first prince was not supposed to suffer this mysterious illness for another 6 months. This event should have occurred much later. The fact that it was happening now meant the timeline had already begun changing. The first prince's collapse and his own crow transformation had both occurred far earlier than expected. Since the original 7th prince never possessed any form of manis or transformation ability, staring at the unfolding chaos, Rand began suspecting that his arrival in this world had altered far more than he initially realized. The aftermath of the ritual left the palace in complete turmoil, but no one suffered more than the first prince himself. Everything had been perfectly normal that morning, yet now his body refused to obey him. Every attempt to circulate manis brought unbearable pain. As the agony intensified, he collapsed to his knees and struggled to understand why such a thing was happening to him of all people. The thought alone was unbearable. He was the first prince, the man expected to inherit the throne and become the next emperor. Unlike ordinary people, he had spent his entire life believing he stood above everyone else. Desperation slowly replaced his confidence as he grabbed a dagger and attempted to regain control of his emotions. Just then, a voice emerged from the darkness and calmly advised him to put the hookah away if he wished to survive. The prince immediately slayed the hookah toward the source of the voice. His eyes widened when a familiar figure stepped out from the shadows. Standing there was none other than Ran Aaron. The unexpected visitor looked completely at ease despite infiltrating one of the most heavily guarded rooms in the palace. The first prince demanded an explanation, unable to comprehend how someone could enter his private chambers unnoticed. forest. Ran merely smiled and remarked that if he had truly arrived as an assassin, the conversation would already be over. The statement only deepened the prince's shock. When asked how he had entered, Ran casually claimed that he had simply climbed the outer wall of the palace. Whether the prince believed the explanation or not made little difference. According to Ran, the method of entry was insignificant compared to the condition of the first prince's body. Instead of answering directly, the prince merely smirked. He suddenly burst into laughter. The reaction seemed almost insane. Yet it revealed that he had already reached a conclusion. Believing himself clever, he accused Ran of poisoning him in order to gain leverage over him in the future. Convinced he had uncovered the truth, the prince attempted to attack his younger brother. Before the strike could land, Ran calmly warned him that the current suffering was only the beginning. Within a week, the pain would become so severe that he would beg for it to stop. Those words immediately halted the attack. For the first time since their conversation began, genuine uncertainty appeared on the prince's face. Ran then explained that he had not poisoned anyone and possessed no secret scheme. According to him, even he did not know who was responsible for the mysterious illness. What he did know was that the prince's condition would continue deteriorating unless something changed. Speaking with unusual seriousness, Ran declared that this conversation represented the first prince's final opportunity to save himself. Every word carried enough confidence to make the warning difficult to ignore. With his message delivered, Ran transformed into a crow and departed through the window. Flying into the stormy night, he reflected on how fortunate it was that the prince lacked the courage to follow him. Left alone inside the room, the first prince sat in silence while despair slowly consumed him. The frightened prince would become a useful piece on the board. Moving forward, the crow form proved incredibly useful for traveling across great distances. Everything seemed peaceful until a sudden sense of danger washed over him. Sometime later, attention returned to the palace. For 2 entire days, Ran remained isolated inside his room while contemplating his next move. Outside the door, Achan grew increasingly anxious. The prince had neither eaten nor made a single sound, causing her imagination to run wild with frightening possibilities. If something happened to a member of the imperial family under her watch, the consequences could be disastrous. Unable to endure the worry any longer, she knocked on the door and cautiously called out to him. Moments later, the door opened. Startled by the sudden appearance of the prince, Anna lost her balance and stumbled into the room. The tray she carried flew from her hands, scattering food across the floor. She landed face first on the ground while panic instantly filled her expression. Ran watched the entire disaster unfold without showing much sympathy. Meanwhile, Anna immediately threw herself into a desperate apology. Tears streamed down her face as she begged for forgiveness and struggled to form complete sentences. The sight reminded Ran just how terrified the palace staff remained of the original owner of this body. Even the smallest mistake seemed capable of convincing them that punishment awaited. After questioning how she intended to compensate him for dirtying both the floor and his shoes, Ran ultimately decided not to make things worse. Instead, he ordered her to clean everything within 5 minutes and leave immediately afterward. He also forbade her from entering his quarters without permission. More than anything, he simply wanted some peace and quiet. Time continued moving forward. 1 month passed since the disastrous ritual that changed everything. Throughout the palace, rumors spread that the first prince had lost his manus and could no longer wield the power that once secured his position. For many princes and princesses, the news represented a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The balance of power within the imperial family had begun shifting for the first time in years. In an effort to silence the growing rumors, the first prince persuaded the emperor to move the annual royal hunt forward. Nobles and royals from across the empire quickly gathered for the event. Riding through the forest on horseback, Ran found himself focused on a completely different concern. The only question that truly mattered was whether these changes had already affected the protagonist of Dark Header. Today was the day he intended to find out. Ran quietly searched the crowd. The original hero of the novel should be somewhere nearby, and meeting that person would reveal just how much the story had already changed. Whether the future remained intact or had begun diverging completely was a mystery he intended to solve before it was too late. Before long, Salos Eron appeared beside him with his usual expression of disdain. The 8th prince immediately began mocking, comparing him to an insect and remarking that the black horse suited the darkness in his soul. Rather than responding, Ran simply ignored every insult and continued riding forward. The lack of reaction only irritated Salos further, though Ran paid little attention to the younger prince's frustration. The group eventually arrived at the Tower of the Beginning, a massive structure standing at the entrance of the imperial forest. Every year, this location hosted the opening ritual that marked the beginning of the royal hunt. While many people viewed the event as a competition, those familiar with imperial politics understood its true purpose. The hunt served as a stage where the royal family could display its power before nobles from across the empire. Even the emperor knew that the event was more about influence than hunting. hunting. At the center of attention stood Razia, the first prince. Following the emperor's order, he stepped forward and prepared to perform the ceremonial display. One of his siblings jokingly asked whether he had already decided upon the reward he would request after winning. Razia confidently declared that victory already belonged to him and that his wish had long been decided. His words reflected the confidence expected from the man considered closest to the throne. Among the gathered nobles, whispers quietly spread through the crowd. Although many publicly praised the prince, rumors regarding his mysterious illness continued circulating. Rhea overheard some of the discussions and immediately recalled Rand's warning from a month ago. Doubt crept into his mind despite his efforts to suppress it. Meanwhile, Rand observed everything from a distance with a faint smile. Unlike everyone else present, he already knew exactly what was about to happen. Razia activated his manus and released a tremendous amount of energy. Dark clouds gathered overhead while powerful winds swept across the surrounding landscape. Blue energy spiraled around him, forming a colossal vortex that rose toward the heavens. The pressure generated by the ritual forced spectators to retreat. Several princes ordered nearby nobles to move back while staring at the spectacle in amazement. Standing at the center of the storm, Razia shouted his own name and declared himself the future ruler of the empire. The proclamation echoed across the mountain as a massive wave of water erupted from his body and surged upward. Within moments, the entire area seemed swallowed by blue energy. The overwhelming display stunned everyone present. Rain soon began falling from the heavens, and not a single spectator could hide their amazement. Even seasoned military leaders found themselves impressed by the sheer scale of the power. One general openly remarked that this represented the true might of the imperial bloodline. Soon afterward, nobles and soldiers alike began chanting Rossia's name. The first prince allowed himself a sigh of relief as the crowd's admiration washed over him. However, Rand knew the truth behind the miracle everyone was celebrating. A month earlier, inside the prince's chambers, he had secretly provided Rhea with a special stone and instructed him to continuously channel his manus into it. According to Rand, the artifact could absorb corrupted manes and temporarily suppress the mysterious condition, destroying his body. Although the explanation had sounded questionable at the time, desperation forced Rhea to follow the instructions. The result now stood before everyone's eyes. Even so, Ron understood that the stone only delayed the inevitable. The artifact had originally appeared much later in the story and was never meant to solve the problem permanently. A frightened servant hurried toward Ran and presented a large bag. The man appeared terrified even while speaking, fearful of making a mistake in front of the infamous seventh prince. After confirming that the item had arrived safely, Rand dismissed him. A loud horn suddenly echoed throughout the area. The emperor raised his hand and surveyed every participant with a serious expression. At that signal, the royal hunting competition officially began. Riders charged into the imperial forest while nobles debated whether competing was even worthwhile. Most already assumed that a member of the imperial family would claim victory regardless of their own efforts. Unlike the others, Rand cared very little about winning. He guided his horse calmly into the forest while focusing on a completely different objective. His true target was Agony Fetty, the former commander of the Knights and one of the most important figures connected to future events. Not far away, Agony listened as a servant praised the terrifying power displayed during the ritual. The Duke casually remarked that the Emperor's true goal had been to crush the confidence of the nobility and remind them who ruled the empire. His servant nervously advised him to save such comments for private conversations, but Agony merely laughed and dismissed the concern. Meanwhile, Rand traveled deeper into the forest. The hunting grounds had been divided into 3 separate regions designed for small, medium, and large prey. Studying a map, he recalled an important detail from Dark Header. During this very hunt, the story's protagonist would present a rare golden fox to the Emperor and attract the attention of the entire empire. Knowing this, Rand had already spent weeks scouting the forest in crow form. The novel contains several clues regarding the fox's habitat. After carefully piecing together those details, Rand concluded that the creature likely lived near a secluded lake hidden deep within the forest. If his information was correct, the protagonist would eventually appear there. Reaching the location first would allow him to confirm whether the original story still followed the same path. Confident in his preparations, Rand continued forward. He was especially relieved that Sechin had successfully delivered the requested bag. Once that bag reached Agony Fetus, an important part of his plan would fall into place. Unfortunately, his confidence proved premature. Without warning, his horse suddenly accelerated, nearly throwing him from the saddle. Completely caught off guard, Ron struggled to maintain his balance while demanding to know what had gotten into the stubborn beast. After a chaotic sprint through the forest, the horse finally came to a stop. Believing the animal might be injured, Rand climbed down and carefully inspected it. He questioned whether it had spotted a dangerous predator nearby, but the horse showed no signs of concern. The truth finally dawned on him. The horse was refusing to carry the heavy bag. A Annoyed by the discovery, Ran scolded the animal for its stubbornness and accused it of lacking even the most basic work ethic. Far from feeling guilty, the horse responded by stamping its hoof against the ground in protest. Then, before Ran could react, it turned around and galloped away at full speed. Silence filled the forest. Standing alone in the middle of the wilderness with the heavy bag still in his hands, Ran watched his only transportation disappear into the distance. Deep within the imperial forest, Agony Fetus continued his hunt while accompanied by his loyal assistant, Tolan. The old duke showed little interest in chasing ordinary prey. Wolves, deer, and other creatures posed no challenge for a man who had spent his entire life on battlefields. As he rode through the forest, he quietly reflected on the passage of time and admitted that age had finally begun catching up to him. Although countless people viewed him as a living legend, Agony considered himself nothing more than an old soldier whose best years were slowly fading away. Tolan immediately objected to such thoughts. From his perspective, the Duke remained one of the greatest heroes in the Empire's history. His victories as a commander had protected the nation through countless conflicts, and few people could rival his accomplishments. Even so, Agony simply smiled and continued looking ahead. After a long silence, the Duke asked whether Talon had ever seen members of the imperial family up close. The young assistant admitted that he had only observed them from a distance. Hearing that answer brought back old memories. Agony recalled explaining to his son years ago that the imperial bloodline stood above ordinary people like beings chosen by the heavens themselves. Their family had spent generations serving the throne, and one day his son would inherit that responsibility as well. He remembered proudly showing his son the merchant organization connected to their family and teaching him about the duties that came with their position. However, among all his memories, one particular incident remained impossible to forget. During a journey through one of the Empire cities, his carriage had suddenly stopped after something became caught beneath the wheel. When the driver stepped down to investigate, Agony noticed a severely injured child lying on the road. The scene suggested that a terrible accident had occurred moments earlier. According to the information available at the time, the child had been a thief who attempted to rob a temple. Such tragedies were unfortunately common in that region. Yet, despite hearing the explanation, Agony could never completely erase the image from his mind. The memory became even more vivid when he remembered his son's reaction. Curious about the commotion, the boy had attempted to leave the carriage and investigate for himself. Agony immediately ordered him to stay inside, unwilling to let his child witness such a grim scene. Even now, years later, he occasionally wondered whether misfortune truly existed everywhere, regardless of how noble or prosperous an empire claimed to be. Talon's voice eventually pulled him back to the present. The assistant reminded him that they needed to continue moving if they hoped to preserve their family's honor during the royal hunt. Nodding in agreement, Agony revealed that he knew a location where a golden fox was likely to appear. Meanwhile, Ranaburn was experiencing a far less dignified adventure. Still carrying the heavy bag abandoned by his runaway horse, he sprinted through the forest while muttering curses under his breath. Every step reminded him of how thoroughly the animal had betrayed him. Transforming into a crow would solve the problem instantly, but doing so would force him to leave the bag behind. Since the contents were crucial to his plans involving Agony Fetus, that option was out of the question. The dense forest only made matters worse. Wild animals could appear at any moment, and Rand possessed neither a weapon nor any meaningful combat ability. When a sudden rustling sound echoed nearby, he immediately froze. His imagination began supplying all sorts of terrifying possibilities. Faced with an unknown threat, he briefly considered abandoning the bag and escaping. Picking up a stone, Rand tossed it toward the source of the sound in hopes of distracting whatever creature might be lurking there. The stone flew through the trees with impressive accuracy. Unfortunately, it did not strike an animal. A loud impact echoed through the forest. Rand's eyes widened in horror as he realized what had happened. The stone had flown directly into Talon's face, knocking the poor assistant unconscious almost instantly. Hidden behind the trees, Rand stared at the scene in complete disbelief. Of all the targets in the entire forest, he had somehow managed to hit the one person he absolutely should not have touched. Seeing tall and sprawled across the ground, the Duke's expression hardened. Agony Fetus was not merely some influential noble. According to the story, he would eventually become the mentor of the novel's protagonist and one of the most respected figures in the Empire. Rand had carefully prepared a plan involving the Duke. His original intention was to wait near the Golden Fox's habitat, accused Agony of interfering with his prey, and used the situation to create an opportunity for future interactions. Now that entire plan had collapsed. Instead of engineering a favorable first meeting, he had ambushed the Duke's assistant with a rock. As Agony examined the stone, suspicion filled his eyes. The attack looked deliberate, making it reasonable to assume that an assassin had been targeting him. After several moments, Tolan slowly regained consciousness and sat upright. Relief immediately appeared on the Duke's face. He questioned his assistant about the incident, hoping to learn who had attacked him. Hidden nearby, Ran felt his soul leaving his body. The moment Talon remembered everything, disaster would follow. The assistant squeezed his eyes shut and struggled to recall what had happened. Watching him think caused Rand's panic to increase with every passing second. Agony's family possessed immense influence throughout the Empire. Offending them was practically a death sentence for anyone lacking protection. Then something unexpected happened. Despite the dramatic buildup, Talon remembered almost nothing. Apart from a small cut on his forehead, he had suffered no serious injuries. Embarrassed by the situation, he simply apologized for failing to notice the attack. The explanation instantly allowed Rand to breathe again. Although Agony accepted the answer, he remained unconvinced. The veteran commander possessed sharp instincts, and something continued bothering him. Slowly, his gaze shifted toward the exact location where Rand was hiding among the trees. The moment their eyes nearly met, Rand abandoned all thoughts of dignity. He turned around and ran behind him. Agony informed Tolan to remain where he was and immediately began pursuing the mysterious attacker. And Rand had nobody to blame except himself. He sprinted through the forest as fast as his legs could carry him. Unfortunately, he knew from the beginning that escaping a legendary hero through sheer speed was nearly impossible. His lungs burned with exhaustion, and the heavy bag only made every step more difficult. Even so, he continued running while desperately hoping he had created enough distance to lose Agony fetus. That hope vanished almost instantly. Agony suddenly appeared not far behind him. Still maintaining an alarming pace despite his age, the Duke demanded that the mysterious attacker reveal himself, and Rand realized he would be caught sooner or later. Dropping the bag and transforming into a crow crossed his mind, but abandoning his plan now would ruin everything he had worked toward. Rather than surrender, he tried something completely different. A strange darkness suddenly gathered around his feet. The unfamiliar energy wrapped around his body and pushed him forward with explosive force. Even Agony was caught off guard when the distance between them rapidly widened. The Duke stared in disbelief. Frustrated, Agony swung his sword through the air, but the attack struck nothing. By the time he reached the clearing ahead, his quarry had completely vanished. Meanwhile, Ran experienced a bizarre sensation. His body suddenly felt lighter than before, and for a moment, he wondered whether he had somehow transformed into a crow while still running. Before he could investigate, the sound of hooves reached his ears. Looking to the side, he found himself staring directly into the eye of a horse racing beside him. Elsewhere in the forest, the royal hunt continued normally. Several princes had already begun displaying their accomplishments, hoping to attract attention from the emperor and the gathered nobles. One prince proudly stood before a massive bear he had successfully hunted. Another royal congratulated him and remarked that victory seemed all but guaranteed. The prince accepted the praise with a satisfied smile and revealed that he had already decided what reward he intended to request from the emperor. Far away from the celebrations, Rand collapsed beneath a tree and stared at the sky. Exhaustion covered every inch of his body. More importantly, he had lost the bag. The realization struck him harder than any physical injury. Lying on the grass with his hands covering his face, he lamented the loss of the most important piece of his entire plan. Everything had already gone wrong once when he accidentally attacked Talon. Eventually, he forced himself to stand. Giving up would accomplish nothing. If the bag had fallen somewhere during the chase, then he could still recover it. At the same time, Agony Fetus and Tolan had reunited. The Duke checked on his assistant and asked whether he was feeling any better. Although still somewhat dizzy, Tolan assured him that the injury was minor. Their conversation eventually shifted toward the failed pursuit. Agony admitted that he had lost his target, though he could not decide whether the mysterious figure had simply been too fast or whether age was finally catching up to him. That was when Talon noticed something nearby. A bag rested among the tall grass. The Duke picked it up and examined it curiously. From the outside, it appeared valuable, but opening it only deepened the mystery. The bag was filled entirely with stones. Hidden nearby, Rand spotted them. The moment he recognized the bag, all caution disappeared. Panic overwhelmed him, and he immediately rushed forward. His sudden appearance startled both men. Tolan froze the instant he recognized the newcomer and stammered the seventh prince's name. Realizing a member of the imperial family stood before them, Agony and Tolan immediately dropped to one knee. Rand quickly reclaimed control of the situation. With an irritated expression, he demanded to know why his belongings were in their possession. Agony calmly explained that he had simply discovered the bag while searching the area. The explanation sounded reasonable, but Rand deliberately treated it with suspicion. He remarked that everyone claimed innocence after being caught and questioned whether they had intended to steal it. Agony immediately swore upon his family's honor that no such thing had happened. The conversation then shifted toward Talon's injury. Rand casually asked why the young assistant was bleeding. Agony explained that an accident had occurred earlier. However, the assistant continued staring at the prince with growing uncertainty. The more he thought about the attack, the more familiar the culprit seemed. Slowly, Tolan stepped forward. His trembling voice suggested that he was on the verge of of making an important realization. Grabbing the young man's hair, Ran harshly reprimanded him for speaking out of turn and behaving disrespectfully before royalty. He even hinted that a blade could easily correct such behavior. Fear immediately filled Talon's eyes, leaving him unable to say another word. Without hesitation, the Duke stepped forward and defended his assistant. The gesture did not surprise Ran. According to everything he knew about Agony Fetus, the man would never abandon those under his protection. That unwavering loyalty was one of the reasons he would eventually become a legendary mentor in the story. Ran decided it was time to proceed with the true objective. He handed the bag to Agony and declared that their meeting must have been fate. The prince then emphasized that the contents were extremely important and warned that the bag must never be lost under any circumstances. Although the words sounded simple on the surface, the implication behind them was far more significant. Agony accepted the bag while studying the prince carefully. For a brief moment, their eyes met. With that accomplished, Ran finally departed. As he walked away, relief slowly replaced the tension weighing on his shoulders. He knew he had behaved terribly throughout the encounter, but planting a seed of doubt in Agony's mind had been necessary. Sometimes achieving a goal required becoming the villain in someone else's story. After the prince disappeared into the forest, Talon immediately apologized for causing trouble. Agony dismissed the apology and pointed out that the young man was fortunate to have escaped with only a minor injury. Then Talon remembered everything. With a serious expression, he revealed that he finally recalled the identity of the person who had thrown the stone earlier. The culprit had been Ranaburin himself. Before he could continue, Agony abruptly silenced him. The old duke's expression remained unreadable as he ordered his assistant to say nothing more. As Ran-Eberron left Agony Fades behind, he reflected on the future he remembered from Darkheader. In the original story, the duke only turned against the imperial family after suffering the devastating loss of his son. That tragedy shattered the loyalty he had carried his entire life and eventually pushed him toward rebellion. If Ram wanted events to unfold sooner, then a powerful catalyst was necessary. The seeds had already been planted, and now all he could do was wait for them to grow. Meanwhile, the royal hunt was nearing its conclusion. Roja finally revealed the wish he intended to request as the competition's victor. With a cold smile, he announced plans to develop the region surrounding the temple. On the surface, the proposal sounded beneficial, but the true objective quickly became clear. The project would remove the countless vagrants and impoverished people living near the area. To many nobles, the decision seemed reasonable. To others, it felt far more ominous. Rand silently concluded that Agony Fetus's fate had become unavoidable. The Duke possessed a strong sense of justice and compassion, traits that would inevitably clash with the direction the Empire was taking. Combined with everything else that had already happened, the path leading toward future conflict appeared clearer than ever. As the sun slowly descended beyond the horizon, hidden among the bushes, Rand carefully surveyed his surroundings and confirmed that no witnesses remained nearby. He had checked the area repeatedly to ensure that every detail of his plan remained secure. Even so, an uncomfortable feeling lingered in his chest. Manipulating events from the shadows made him feel less like a hero and more like a villain. Not long afterward, an elegant woman approached through the forest. The moment Rand saw her, he immediately recognized her identity. The newcomer was Mental Aberron, the first princess and one of the most influential members of the imperial family. Her beauty was striking, but what truly made people uneasy was the unreadable expression she constantly wore. Rand respectfully greeted his older sister, only for Mental to casually dismiss the formalities. According to her, there was no need for excessive etiquette between siblings who shared the same bloodline. The conversation quickly shifted toward a far more troublesome topic. Mental calmly asked where his horse had gone. Ren immediately fabricated an excuse. Unfortunately, the first princess was not someone easily deceived. With a cold gaze, she informed him that she could see straight through the lie. When he awkwardly questioned what she meant, Mental revealed that one of her attendants had discovered a lone black horse wandering through the forest. Since the animal belonged to Ran and had apparently failed to properly serve a member of the imperial family, she had already ordered it to be disposed of. The revelation nearly broke him. Internally, Ran felt an overwhelming urge to mourn the loss of the troublesome horse. Externally, however, he quickly dropped to one knee and apologized for losing the animal in the first place. Mental merely instructed him to stand and remarked that she did not wish to appear as though she were punishing her younger brother. She admitted that she was relieved he had returned safely and even offered to arrange a replacement horse for him. The interaction left Ran more confused than ever. Mental Aberron always seemed impossible to read. One moment she appeared threatening, while the next she displayed genuine concern. Trying to understand her thoughts felt like attempting to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. After the princess departed, attention shifted to a medical tent elsewhere in the hunting grounds. Tolan sat on a bed while a physician examined the injury on his forehead. The doctor appeared both amused and bewildered by the situation. According to him, injuries caused by a single rock were common enough, but being struck in such a bizarre manner bordered on absurdity. When Agony Fetus asked about the recovery time, the physician explained that the injury would require roughly a week of rest. The announcement devastated Tolan. Missing the remainder of the competition felt like a personal disaster. Agony, however, quickly reassured him. The Duke insisted that he and Jack could handle everything while Tolan recovered. Seeing the concern in his master's eyes brought a smile to the assistant's face. Even after all these years, Agony continued treating those under his command like family. The Duke eventually joked that he had never once granted Tall and proper time off. According to him, the young assistant's greatest dream seemed to involve eating good food and spending entire days playing games. The light-hearted conversation briefly eased the tension surrounding the injury. Agony even promised to win the grand prize and make that dream a reality. Night gradually descended over the camp. The Duke was such a devoted protector that he often overlooked dangers directed at those closest to him, a trait admirable enough to inspire respect, yet dangerous enough to invite tragedy. His attention immediately landed on the heavy bag of stones Ran had entrusted to him. Despite not understanding its purpose, he found himself unable to ignore the strange responsibility attached to it. Lifting the bag once more, his feet eventually carried him toward a familiar location. Agony remembered bringing his son Flynn there years ago. During that visit, he had told the boy about Sierra the Great, the legendary savior who descended during humanity's darkest age. According to history, Sierra the Great possessed mysterious powers unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. 1,000 years ago, he united countless warring territories beneath a single banner and established what would eventually become the Abian Empire. More importantly, he founded the imperial bloodline that still ruled the continent to this day. Looking back on the memory now, the Duke felt a warmth mixed with sadness. His son remained the most precious person in his life. Everything Agony had accomplished and every sacrifice he had made ultimately traced back to his desire to protect that child. He had always hoped his son would inherit his ideals and proudly serve the imperial family. Yet while carrying the heavy bag through the darkness, a strange thought entered his mind. Why was he obeying Ran Aberon's bizarre request so faithfully? The stones served no obvious purpose. The prince's behavior had been suspicious from beginning to end. The royal hunt had reached its conclusion far earlier than anyone expected. Throughout the gathering, nobles exchanged surprised whispers while discussing the strange sounds of beasts that had echoed through the forest during the night. Most had already reached the same conclusion. Roja had dominated the competition so thoroughly that the 4-day event ended after only a single night. The achievement left a powerful impression on everyone present. Standing before the assembled nobles, Raja was officially declared the victor of the royal hunt. The emperor offered his congratulations, while the first prince respectfully thanked his father. According to tradition, the winner was entitled to request a reward. Anticipation immediately spread throughout the crowd as nobles began speculating about what the future emperor might ask for this year. After kneeling before the throne, Razia finally revealed his wish. He explained that the land surrounding the temple had become overrun with vagrants and displaced people. According to him, restoring the beauty and dignity of the sacred grounds required decisive action. While his words sounded reasonable on the surface, the true meaning behind them quickly became obvious. His proposal would grant him the authority to completely remove those people from the region. The moment those words left his mouth, Agony Fetus froze. Sweat appeared across the Duke's face as old memories flooded his mind. Images from battlefields, years of service, and most importantly, his son all resurfaced at once. Every warning sign that had been planted over recent months suddenly aligned. The future he feared seemed to stand directly before him. For a long moment, Agony remained motionless. Then he made his decision. Gripping his sword, the Duke stepped forward. Gasps spread throughout the gathering as one of the Empire's greatest heroes began walking toward the royal family with weapon in hand. His expression carried absolute determination. Deep within his heart, he apologized to his son and vowed that he could not allow this path to continue. Elsewhere, another part of Ran's plan was already moving into place. Ran appeared before him and calmly instructed him to move slowly. The prince ordered him to gather medicine and then questioned why he was still resting when the ceremony had already begun. Confused by the statement, Talon asked which ceremony the prince was referring to. The answer immediately sent him rushing outside. Ignoring the pain in his head, the assistant forced his way through the crowd. By the time he finally broke through the crowd, the scene before him left him speechless. Agony Fetus stood on his knees. Dozens of knights surrounded the Duke with drawn weapons. At the center of the arena, Raja glared down at him from above. The first prince demanded an explanation for Agony's actions. In response, the Duke calmly declared that his family had served the imperial bloodline faithfully for over 1,000 years. Generation after generation had sacrificed everything in service to the throne. Yet somewhere along the way, that loyalty had become twisted. Instead of protecting the empire through honorable means, families like his were increasingly unwittingly being used to suppress the powerless. With those words, Agony formally presented his request to the emperor. The ruler listened in silence. His expression remained cold and unreadable. Eventually, the emperor acknowledged the duke's lifelong devotion. He admitted that Agony Fetus had served the empire more faithfully than almost anyone alive. However, that loyalty only made the situation more ironic. The very devotion that earned him respect had also driven him to challenge an imperial decree. The emperor's power slowly began gathering around him. His gaze never left the kneeling duke. According to imperial law, obstructing the will of the throne carried severe consequences. Agony understood this better than anyone. Closing his eyes, he calmly accepted responsibility for his actions and declared that he would willingly pay for his transgression with his own life. The statement shattered Toland's composure. The assistant screamed his master's name and desperately tried to reach him. In the crowd, Ran observed everything. Part of him wished the true protagonist could witness this moment as well. Far from the ceremony, a lone traveler knelt beside a river. Exhausted from his journey, the young man scooped water into his hands and prepared to drink. Before he could do so, strange blue energy suddenly began flowing across the surface of the river. The phenomenon immediately captured his attention. The young traveler stared silently at the vision. Slowly, he lowered the hood covering his face. The person witnessing everything from afar was none other than Rattle, the true protagonist of the Dark Header. Story then turned to one of the Empire's most celebrated figures, the head of the Fetus family. For generations, his name had been honored throughout the continent because his lineage had safeguarded the imperial family through countless wars, epidemics, and political crisis. He was the same man who had once held the prestigious position of Imperial Knight Commander, leading the Empire's strongest warriors into battle. For 3 decades, he had fought on battlefields across the land without wavering. His swordsmanship remained unmatched, and his determination never faltered. Throughout those years, he secured victories that protected entire provinces, devised strategies that ended conflicts before they escalated, and built a reputation so formidable that even his enemies treated his name with caution. Yet, despite everything he had accomplished, he now faced the gravest accusation imaginable. The Empire had branded him a criminal for offending the imperial family. The man once revered as a hero, Agony Fetus, knelt before judgment in chains. As the proceedings continued, the first prince, Raja Aberon, stepped forward. Anger was clearly visible on his face as he prepared to pass judgment. Raising his hand, he gathered the moisture in the air around him. Water condensed into glowing streams of magical energy, twisting and swirling under his control. Without hesitation, the prince delivered his verdict and sentenced Agony Fetus to immediate execution. The moment the sentence was declared, Raja unleashed his magic. The gathered water surged forward like a living creature. It wrapped around the duke and imprisoned him within its grasp. The force of the spell sent water exploding outward, soaking nearby nobles and scattering droplets across the stone courtyard. Shock rippled through the crowd. Few had ever witnessed the first prince display such overwhelming magical power in public. Trapped inside the rotating sphere of water, Duke Feta struggled against the immense pressure. Every breath became difficult. Water crushed against his chest, clouded his vision, and threatened to fill his lungs. Despite the distortion around him, he could still make out figures beyond the watery prison. Among them stood Tolan. The assistant's face had gone pale. Fear was written across his features as he watched the duke suffer. His body trembled uncontrollably, and panic filled his eyes. Seeing him there, Agony Fetus slowly realized something. The duke had known from the beginning that Tolan's illness had been exaggerated. However, in what he believed were his final moments, none of that mattered anymore. Instead, he felt relief. Simply seeing Tolan alive and standing before him brought unexpected comfort. Even while enduring immense pain, a faint smile appeared on his face. His thoughts turned toward gratitude that the young man remained healthy. At the same time, another concern weighed heavily on his heart, his son Flynn. As death approached, the duke silently entrusted Flynn's future to Tolan. He hoped his loyal assistant would continue looking after the boy after he was gone. While his thoughts lingered there, his eyes drifted beyond Tolan and settled on another figure. The 7th prince stood quietly among the crowd. Unlike everyone else, the prince appeared calm and unreadable. There was no visible panic or outrage on his face, yet his lips moved subtly as though he were quietly speaking to himself. Though the words were difficult to hear, they carried enough meaning to spark something within the duke. For a brief moment, a flicker of resistance returned to his heart. Unfortunately, Raja had no intention of allowing him any chance to survive. With another gesture, the prince manipulated the water prison and launched it skyward. The duke was hurled upward with terrifying speed. Within moments, he had ascended far above the clouds. The acceleration ravaged his already damaged body. Blood escaped from his mouth and trailed behind him in the thin air. Every bone in his body shook under the strain. Tolan could only watch. Held back by soldiers, he was powerless to intervene. Tears streamed down his face as he witnessed what appeared to be his master's execution. The entire capital watched in horror. Even the 7th prince remained motionless as events unfolded. Far Far away from the execution grounds, Flynn sat quietly at his desk, studying. A sudden movement outside his window caught his attention. Looking toward the sky, he noticed a glowing blue streak descending from above. To him, it resembled a falling star. He had no way of knowing that the object falling from the heavens was his own father. The water prison had carried Duke Fetus so high that people across the capital could see it. Among those witnesses was Riedel, the true protagonist of Dark Hitter. The instant he noticed the descending blue light, he sprang into action. His body exploded forward with incredible speed. The force of his leap cracked the ground beneath him, as he crossed an enormous distance in a single bound. Moments later, he arrived directly beneath the falling Duke, peering through the swirling water. He could barely make out a figure trapped inside. Without hesitation, he launched himself upward once again, his hands stretched toward the Duke. For a brief instant, it seemed as though he might succeed. Only a small distance separated them. Then everything stopped. Realizing the danger ahead, Riedel abruptly halted his advance. His feet carved deep trenches into the earth as he brought himself to a stop. Beyond that point lay certain death. Going any farther would have cost him his own life. Breathing heavily, he remained at the edge of the danger zone and watched helplessly as the Duke continued his descent. Unable to save him, he stood soaked by the water magic and watched the figure disappear from view. Back at the Tower of Beginning, Tolan remained frozen. He had just witnessed the apparent death of the man he admired most. His mind struggled to process what had happened. Nearby, Duke Fetus's sword sheath and a single boot lay abandoned in a puddle of water. Around him, nobles whispered among themselves. Many expressed disbelief that such a renowned hero could meet such an end. Others speculated about what would become of the Fetus family now that its leader was gone. Eventually, the Emperor stepped forward and brought the matter to a close. The gathering was informed that the royal hunting competition's closing ceremony would take place at noon. Meanwhile, Raja casually dismissed the entire incident and departed. As he left, the surrounding nobles bowed respectfully. The prince appeared convinced that excessive mercy only encouraged defiance, and he regarded the destruction of the Fetus family as an inevitable consequence of foolishness. Tolan listened silently. As he turned away, the crowd's attitude shifted toward him. Whispers became accusations. Some labeled him a traitor. Others openly showed their contempt. He offered no response and simply continued walking. The seventh prince observed everything from a distance. He understood how devastating the situation must be for Tolan. The assistant and Duke Fetus had spent years together, forming a bond stronger than that of many families. Still, he believed Tolan possessed enough strength to endure the tragedy. Eventually, Tolan returned to his tent. While cleaning the disorder left behind, he discovered a sealed letter hidden beneath a blanket. The seal immediately caught his attention. It bore the crest of the Fetus family. With trembling hands, he opened it. The letter had been written by Duke Fetus. The contents made it clear that the Duke had anticipated the possibility of his own death. He requested prayers for his journey to Fetusterium and entrusted Flynn's future to Tolan. More importantly, he expressed the belief that he might soon commit a terrible mistake. If that happened, he wanted Tolan to understand one thing above all else. None of the responsibility belonged to him. As Tolan continued reading, his vision became blurred with tears. Near the end of the document, Agony Fetus formally appointed Tolan Krissa as acting head of the Fetus family should anything happen to him. The weight of those words proved too much. The letter slipped from Tolan's hands. Overwhelmed by grief, he collapsed and lost consciousness. The final blessing written in the letter invoked the protection of Sierra the Great. Later, elsewhere within the capital, the seventh prince met with Raja. The prince observed that Raja had used his magical power recklessly and noted signs that his condition had worsened. The first prince's body appeared to be suffering even more than it had after the royal hunt. Raja reacted with frustration. He questioned whether the treatment involving the mysterious stone had failed. The seventh prince remained composed and explained that the problem lay not with the treatment, but with Raja's excessive use of magic by releasing so much power at once. He had only aggravated his condition. Although Raja concealed his intentions, hostility lingered behind his gaze. The seventh prince continued by reminding him that his survival depended entirely on the stone. According to him, the illness itself was simple to cure, and Raja owed his continued life to the treatment he had received. His thoughts then shifted unexpectedly toward Tolan. Rumors suggested the assistant remained unconscious, and for reasons he could not fully explain, the prince felt responsible. At that very moment, Tolan finally awakened. Confused and weak, he struggled to understand where he was. His body had grown noticeably frailer. When he attempted to stand, Butler Pale hurried forward to assist him, ignoring concerns about his health. Tolan immediately demanded information about the young Duke and the condition of the family. As the newly appointed acting head, responsibility now rested on his shoulders. While walking through the mansion's corridors, he learned the full extent of the damage. Business partners had abandoned the family. Servants and employees were resigning. Financial stability had collapsed. The family had become isolated. As a direct result of the Duke's actions during their conversation, conversation, the young Duke appeared. The sight of Flynn immediately caused Toland to kneel in respect. The young heir expressed concern for his condition and acknowledged the many difficulties that had emerged during his absence. Among those problems was the heartbreaking reality that they had not even managed to arrange Duke Fetus's funeral. Before the discussion could continue, voices outside drew Toland's attention. Looking through a nearby window, he observed servants spreading rumors. Some claimed the Duke's actions stemmed from the young heir secretly being a vagrant. Others suggested the family itself had become tainted, and that remaining associated with them would be dangerous. The comments hardened Toland's expression. He understood that accusations of treason would haunt the family for years. Determined to protect Flynn's reputation, he immediately ordered severe punishment for anyone spreading such rumors. When hesitation appeared among his subordinates, his tone became colder and more forceful. The order was repeated without compromise. Then he made another shocking decision. There would be no funeral. Both Butler Pale and the young Duke were stunned, yet Toland remained firm. As acting head of the family, he believed preserving the family's survival and honor took priority over everything else. For that reason, he declared that Duke Fetus would no longer be recognized as a member of the family. The decision devastated him. Removing his glasses, he struggled to maintain his composure. Emotion filled his eyes as he forced himself to continue. He despised the choice he was making, but in his mind, it was the only path left to protect what remained of the Fetus family. The blonde prince exploded in anger, destroying everything around him. He raged about being trapped inside the room and vowed to tear someone apart limb from limb. Then he suddenly remembered that there was something important he had to do the next day. His thoughts drifted back to an earlier conversation with Ran. Ran had instructed him to tell everyone that he was entering the Imperial Forest while making sure not to actually go inside. The prince had found the request absurd and demanded an explanation. Ran had calmly explained that he did not want anyone knowing his whereabouts. If people believed the prince was going to the Imperial Forest, nobody else would be allowed to enter it. The prince had pressed further, wanting to know what Ran was scheming and what he planned to do alone in the forest. Ran had casually replied that it was for treatment. That answer had only angered the prince further. He grabbed Ran by the throat, convinced that Ran had begun acting as if he were someone important. He insisted that scholars of the Empire could easily handle a trivial treatment and accused Ran of testing the limits of his patience. In his fury, he threatened to end Ran's life immediately. Even while coughing up blood, Ran continued to smirk. He reminded the prince that using Mance had reduced his lifespan once again. The prince soon coughed up even more blood than Ran. Still smiling, Ran explained that stopping the treatment now would leave the prince unable to move properly for an entire week. He pointed out that the imperial family's reaction would be interesting once rumors spread that the first prince had collapsed. Ran noted that they would either search desperately for a way to save him or react differently. If the treatment failed, another person would inherit the throne as the next emperor. The prince cursed at him, but Ran continued speaking. He told the prince to use his brain if he wished to stay alive. Ran added that perhaps because they shared the same blood, his patience was not very deep. He also ordered the prince to abandon any idea of monitoring him. Disappearing without a trace was one of his specialties. Every attempt to track him had already failed, and continuing those efforts would only delay the treatment and exhaust both of them. As Ran prepared to leave, the prince demanded to know his true goal and why he was doing all of this. Ran silently reflected that his goal was simple. He wanted to survive. The memory faded, bringing the story back to the present. Ran transformed into an eagle and flew into the forest. After arriving, he returned to human form and carefully surveyed the area. He was satisfied after searching the forest 3 times and finding nobody nearby. There was a reason he had emptied the entire forest, even if it meant irritating the first prince. Today, he intended to experiment with his ability. After recent events, he had begun suspecting that he might be capable of transforming into more than one type of animal. If the variety of animals was greater than expected, the ability could prove far more useful than he had originally believed. To discover the truth, he needed a precise understanding of his power. He wanted to know in advance how it could be used. Among all the things he needed to learn, the most urgent was identifying the condition required to transform into a specific animal. The simplest possibility that came to mind was physical contact. Both animals he had successfully transformed into so far had involved prior contact. To test this theory, he decided to catch a completely new animal. He began with a small trap. It was crude, but it contained bait. The top-quality berries he had taken from the imperial kitchen would surely attract something. Before long, a squirrel appeared. Ran thought that if he could catch it, he would finally be able to test his theory. He offered the squirrel food and quickly succeeded in making contact. With that accomplished, he attempted a transformation. Nothing happened. Ran began analyzing the situation. Perhaps the circumstances surrounding each transformation mattered. In the past, he had desperately wanted to fly and desperately wanted to run. He tried to imagine what a squirrel would want. Maybe climbing a tree, maybe hiding inside inside a hole. Yet, he wondered whether such thoughts would work if he did not genuinely mean them. While he was distracted, the squirrel suddenly grabbed his bag and ran away. Ran immediately chased after it. He did not mind the squirrel taking food, but he desperately wanted his bag back. The squirrel climbed a tree while still holding onto the bag. Ran grabbed the other end, but the squirrel refused to let go. The struggle continued until the bag finally tore apart. By the time everything ended, Ran returned to the palace in terrible condition. A maid arrived with dinner and was shocked by his appearance. His clothes were filthy and he looked exhausted. Ran calmly claimed that he had simply gotten dirty while taking a walk in front of the palace. The maid accepted the explanation. Meanwhile, Ran thought about how close he had come to being discovered while transforming into a crow. In the end, he had failed to figure out how to transform into a new animal and had spent the entire day chasing that troublesome squirrel. Ran instructed the maid to bring him a new set of clothes. The maid agreed, but then asked whether he had brought the squirrel back with him. Ran looked into his bag and was startled to find the squirrel still there. The squirrel immediately attempted to escape. The maid feared that the prince intended to kill it. She pleaded for the creature's life and offered to handle it herself. Ignoring the matter entirely, Ran repeated his order for new clothes. Terrified, the maid rushed away to carry out the command. On her way, she unexpectedly encountered the first princess. The maid quickly lowered her head. The princess asked where she was rushing off to in such a hurry. Frightened, the maid fell to her knees and begged for mercy. The princess then noticed the clothes in her hands and questioned her about them. She suspected that the maid had secretly stolen imperial property. The maid desperately denied the accusation. She swore by Sierra the Great that she was innocent. She explained that the seventh prince had dirtied his clothes while taking a walk in the garden. The princess placed a hand on the maid's head and used her mind-reading ability. To her, it did not matter whether the maid's words were true or false. Deceiving her was impossible. As she searched through the maid's thoughts, she examined whether the story was genuine or merely an excuse to save herself. Then, she sensed Ran's presence through the maid's memories. At that moment, the princess realized something important. Ran had not been in the garden at all. He had been conducting business deep inside the imperial forest. Night had fallen over the imperial palace as warm light shone from the royal residence. Inside his room, Ran was sweating while staring at the squirrel that had somehow followed him all the way from the forest after hiding inside his bag. He could not understand how it had reached the palace, but one thing was certain. A wild animal wandering inside the imperial palace was a serious problem. As he tried to corner the squirrel, he thought about returning it to the forest. However, the squirrel continued hiding in the corner and refused to cooperate. Seeing the small animal also reminded Ran of his previous life, where rats inside the walls had constantly kept him awake. Combined with the fact that the original story had already started changing, his irritation continued to grow. Determined to end the problem, Ran finally managed to catch the squirrel. However, the creature immediately bit his hand, forcing him to let go. The squirrel quickly escaped and climbed up the wall. Since chasing it again would only make it run away, Ran suddenly wondered whether transforming into a squirrel himself would make things easier. The moment that thought crossed his mind, a golden aura suddenly appeared around his body. Looking at the squirrel, Ran finally realized the condition behind his transformation ability. At the same moment, the squirrel suddenly lost consciousness and began falling from the wall. Ran immediately rushed forward to save it. Unfortunately, the door opened before he could understand what was happening. The first princess, Mental Burn, entered the room alongside her maid. The maid had tried to stop her from entering without permission, but Mental ignored the warning. As soon as she entered, she discovered something unbelievable. There were two squirrels inside the room. Both princess and the maid were shocked by the sight. Even though the maid found the scene adorable, Mental could not understand why wild animals were roaming around the seventh prince's residence. The following morning, the squirrel remained attached to Ran and refused to leave his side. As it happily ate nuts beside him, Ran decided that taking it back to the forest would be too troublesome. Instead, he focused on the discovery he had made. He had transformed into a crow, a black horse, and now a squirrel. The only thing all three transformations shared was that he had touched the back of each animal's neck. The condition turned out to be surprisingly specific. However, his biggest concern remained Mental Burn. Thanks to Anna, who claimed the squirrel belonged to Ran, he had managed to avoid suspicion the previous night. But before leaving, Mental had ordered him to meet her the next day. The next morning, Ran entered the first princess's residence. After sitting down, he immediately asked why she had called him. Mental ignored the question and first instructed him to sit properly. Although she smiled calmly, she could not understand how the timid boy who never left the palace had suddenly entered the imperial forest alone. The reason Ran feared her was simple. Mental possessed one of the strongest abilities within the imperial family. While the emperor controlled fire and the first prince controlled water, Mental's mana was known as human. Her ability allowed her to read and manipulate people's minds. She gently placed her hand on Ran's head and asked him to answer honestly. However, Ran already knew that her ability did not work on him. According According to the novel, Mental's power failed under two conditions. The target had to be related to her by blood, and the target also had to genuinely love her as family. Rand fulfilled the first condition, but there was no chance he would ever satisfy the second. Yet her ability still failed to activate. Meanwhile, far away from the palace, another scene was unfolding. Inside a cave hidden behind a waterfall, Agony slowly regained consciousness after being unconscious for a long time. His body trembled as he tried to understand where he was. Before he could react, a man standing in the darkness spoke to him. The stranger revealed that he had survived, but instead of offering help, he immediately drew his sword and pointed it at Agony. The man's name was Radel. With killing intent in his eyes, he asked only one question. Was Agony loyal to the Abern Empire? Confused and unable to understand the situation, Agony realized that his answer would determine whether he lived or died.